Chapter 14, Education. This chapter covers two modules, sociological perspectives on education, and then we're going to take a look at schools as formal organizations. In our look ahead, the questions we will address are: what social purpose does education serve? And do public schools offer everyone a way up the socioeconomic ladder, or do they reinforce divisions among social classes? Just like the family and religion are cultural universals, so is education. Education is a social institution that formally socializes members of society. Education, stated explicitly, is a system when someone formally teaches and others are in the role of the learner. We are going to focus on the formal system of education in modern industrialized societies. First, we will get right into our theoretical perspectives on education, and next we'll take a look at schools as formal organizations, that is, as bureaucracies and subcultures of teachers, even students. And then we'll look at the contemporary trend in education. Something you're experiencing right now, which is homeschooling. All right. So we mentioned that education is the social institution that formally socializes members of our society. The proportion of people aged 25 and older with a high school diploma increased from 41% in 1960 to more than 86% in 2008. The proportion with a college degree rose from 8% in 1960 to 29% in 2008. In recent decades, there's been an increase in those proportions of people getting a high school diploma, a college degree, and advanced professional degrees. The U.S. has a higher proportion of college graduates in comparing them to other industrialized nations. So education has become the social institution that prepares its citizens for the roles demanded by other social institutions like the family and the government and the economy. So we place a high value on education. It's one of our highly valued functions in society is to educate our youth. Now let's discuss our theoretical perspectives on education. In the past few decades, we have noticed an increasing number in the U.S. Of people obtaining high school diplomas, college degrees, and advanced professional degrees. Education is a vast and complex social institution preparing its citizens for those roles demanded by those other social institutions I just mentioned: the family, government, and the economy. So from a functionalist view, according to functionalists, education has both manifest and latent functions. If you remember, we discussed earlier in the semester, a manifest function is an open, stated, conscious function. And a latent function is an unconscious, unintended function. One manifest primary function of education is this transmission of knowledge. Schools teach students how to read and write and do math and speak a foreign language and things like that. And another manifest function is that of assigning a person's status. Now, schools also perform latent or hidden unintended functions. And these are the transmission of culture, the promotion of social and political integration, maintaining social control, and serving as an agent of change. So first we're going to talk about the transmission of culture. This is the first latent function. Schooling exposes young people to the existing beliefs, norms, and values of their existing culture. Schools teach respect for social control and reverence for established institutions such as religion and the family. What is important here in the United States may vary somewhat to what is important in, say, England or someplace in Europe. Culture has been transmitted to students in schools for centuries. Today, the internet offers even a new revolutionary way of transmitting culture by the use of, the internet, search engines, things like Google and Bing. 70% of all internet searches are done by Google. And there's a wealth of information at our fingertips, but we need to be careful about the, the accuracy and, that we're looking at information that has come from a reputable source. Another thing is parents will tend to send their children to schools that sort of model their own beliefs and values. They may choose, private schools or religious schools in order to send their children to that, so that they're getting the norms and values that they want to instill in their children. The second latent function is promoting social and political integration. Education serves the latent function of transforming a population of diverse racial, ethnic, and religious groups into a group sharing a common identity. For example, historically, U.S. schools play an important role in socializing the children of immigrants into the norms, values, and beliefs of our dominant culture. The integrative function of education was most obvious in its emphasis on promoting a common language. Immigrant children were expected to learn English and not speak their native language on school grounds. According to the functionalist, like Terrain in 1974, the functionalist perspective, common identity and social integration fostered by education contributes to societal stability and consensus. So there's an argument. There's been an argument for bilingualism. If you provide education value, it promotes that cultural diversity, allowing children to still be able to speak in their own native language, but then still get learn the education in the United States. The third latent function is maintaining social control. Through the use of social control, schools teach students various skills and values to help prepare them for their future positions in the labor force. Schools teach students, for example, punctuality, discipline, scheduling, responsible work habits, and how to negotiate and navigate a bureaucratic organization. As a social institution, schools reflect the interests of both the family and the economy. Schools act as a transitional agent of social control between the parent and eventual employers in the life cycle of most people. Schools direct and often restrict student aspirations based on the values and prejudices of society. Many are socialized into very gender stereotyped roles. For example, males are often encouraged into careers in math and science and to become doctors and lawyers. And then females are directed into careers such as, service industry careers, like being nursing and childcare workers, teachers. Also, much funding for programs that administrators can support, athletic programs versus the arts and music. So it kind of can restrict a student who is interested in art and music if they don't have those programs available. And I think back in many of the advisors you met over the years in your high school and in college, where are those advisors directing you in your future goals? Is it something that you are interested in doing and pursuing, or is it something they're guiding you into based on most women are nurses versus most men are engineers, and so you want to be on top of what you really want to do. And the fourth latent function is serving as an agent of social change. Affirmative action in admissions and the introduction of sex education classes illustrate the efforts of education to stimulate social change in schools and ultimately in society as a whole. Schools also serve as a meeting ground where people can share distinctive beliefs and traditions. Formal education is directly associated with openness to new ideas and critical analysis. It introduces students to a new way of looking at things, offering new perspectives from, what you've always known in your own inner circle. And the best indicator of an individual's lifetime earnings is the number of years of education they have received. The higher our education, the higher our income potential. Now the conflict perspective. The conflict perspective views education as an instrument of elite domination. Very conflict perspective terminology here. According to conflict theorists, schools socialize students into the values dictated by the powerful. It stifles individualism, creativity, and we're going to look at 3 ways that this happens, or explanations of why. The inhibiting effects of education are particularly apparent in what we call the hidden curriculum, number 1, number 2, credentialism, and number 3, the bestowal of status. Schools are still very characterized by racial isolation as well. 15% of Black and 14% of Latina students attend schools where whites make up less than 1% of enrollment. They refer to these schools as apartheid schools. And so, again, we're going to talk about, from a conflict perspective, the different ways that schools, do this, how this happens, how schools socialize students into values dictated by the powerful. They look at the inequalities that exist, those inequalities in educational opportunities available to different racial and ethnic groups. So first, the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum refers to the standards of behavior that are deemed proper by society and are taught subtly in schools. According to Philip Jackson, teachers tend to focus on obedience to the rules, and the need for control and discipline often takes precedent over the learning process. In this hidden curriculum, children must not speak until the teacher calls on them. And they must regulate their activities and behavior according to a time schedule, or with the sound of the bell. Students must concentrate on their own work and learn individually, not work together, not help others. Value is placed on pleasing the teacher and remaining quiet, and rather than on creative thought and academic learning. In the 1970s, there was a movement for more open classroom, which allowed students to really move around, work in groups. It was very experimental at the time, but now I think we see that model being played out in many schools, in most schools in the country, where children they are encouraged to kind of interact and work in groups and have that morning meeting environment. There's also another type of schooling that is called Montessori, and the emphasis there in those types in a Montessori school is on independence and freedom within limits. I mean, there is a curriculum, but they sort of respect the child's psychological, physical, and social development. And so if a student is interested in the falling leaves at fall, they will incorporate that interest of the student into the variety of lessons throughout that day. That will incorporate it into the science, but also math and even reading. And so they sort of take the lead of the child and what their interests are. So again, fostering that curiosity and independence. Credentialism is a term used to describe the increase in the lowest level of education needed to enter a field. About 50 years ago, a high school diploma was the minimum for entry into the paid labor force. Now, a college diploma is virtually the bare minimum. The number of occupations that are viewed as professions has increased mainly due to this credentialism. Employers may use credentialism as a discriminating factor by raising degree requirements for a position. There's a book entitled The Credentialist Society and Historical Sociology of Education and Stratification that was written by Randall Collins that really discusses this issue at great length. Conflict theorists suggest credentialism really reinforces social inequality, making it really difficult for the poor due to lack of financial resources, the ability to obtain a degree, limited educational opportunities. And next we have the bestowal of status. Conflict theorists suggest that schools sort pupils according to social class backgrounds. Schools tend to preserve social class inequalities in each new generation. Even a single school can reinforce these class differences by putting students into tracks. And another thing, schools in poorer neighborhoods may not have the same resources that schools in more affluent neighborhoods may have. There might be neighborhoods where there's more resources from the parents that live in those neighborhoods. They may have more money collected through the PTA to afford them more resources in the schools. So teachers don't go into their own pockets due to lack of funding in the schools. But also, even like I mentioned, in a single school, there's class differences that can be reinforced in terms of tracking. Now, tracking is the practice of placing students into specific curriculum groups on the basis of their test scores and some other criteria, like evaluations that are conducted, any interest of the child. Sometimes they incorporate, the parental form that just, parents are required to describe their students' successes in education. So this practice often reinforces the disadvantages that children from less affluent families may face if they haven't been exposed, to reading materials and computers and any other forms of educational stimulation during their early childhood years. Since tracking begins very early, and so it can be again as early as first grade, and students are tracked into a first grade reading level or reading group. Conflict theorists believe that the educational inequalities produced by tracking are designed to meet the needs of a modern capitalist society. Further, there were two British sociologists named Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintas. They wrote Schooling in Capitalist America. And they argued that capitalism requires a skilled, disciplined labor force, and that the educational system of the United States is really structured with that objective in mind. And what they referred to in their work is what they call the correspondence principle. This correspondence principle, according to this principle, promotes the values expected of individuals in each social class and perpetuates social class divisions from one generation to the next. So basically it corresponds to their social class. Those values and norms will correspond to the social class they were born into. So for example, working class children are likely to be placed in vocational and general tracks versus students from affluent families who are likely to be tracked in the college prep programs that stress leadership and decision-making skills. This graph, we're still within the conflict perspective, illustrates the costs of tuition, room and board, and it shows the changes from 1963 to 2016. And if you see the lowest line, the green line, the rise in tuition has been less steep at two-year institutions like ours than at any four-year institution. So the dollar amounts seem to increase tremendously in the four-year private colleges and even the four-year public colleges. Community colleges kind of have held their own, and even though they're slightly rising, you get your most bang for your buck in a saving cost of taking quality courses and then being able to transfer to those other schools to save some money. All right, now let's take a look at the feminist perspective. In the U.S., the education system has been characterized by the discriminatory treatment of women. In fact, Oberlin College was the first to admit women in 1833. This was 200 years after the first men's college was established. Women were encouraged to become wives and mothers and to serve men. So what was the point in them getting a college education? Mostly women who were from more affluent families tended to be able to be the ones who attended school. Many female students at the time, when they were admitted to Oberlin, what they were required to do was wash the men's clothes and care for their rooms and serve them their meals. In the 20th century, sexism in education has shown up in other ways. In particular in their stereotypes, negative stereotypes in textbooks, and that's been studied through content analysis. Counselors are pressuring women to study traditional women's subjects. The unequal funding for women's athletic programs, which has been addressed with Title IX. And an employment bias, the bias in employment of teachers. Education discrimination is evident in university professorship and administrative positions, which hold relatively high status and are predominantly held by men. Now, women have made strides in the area of continuing education. Today, women outnumber men at college commencements. There was an article published back in 2010 in the Philadelphia Inquirer reporting a gender gap with more women than men on campus, and even ultimately completing their college degrees. In the interactionist perspective, there is a focus on micro-level classroom dynamics. If you remember micro-level, the interactionist being the micro-level, small-scale, small group, face-to-face interactions. The previous theories we just spoke of, conflict theory, functionalist theory, and even the feminist theory, were macro-level perspectives, the large-scale phenomenon, large societal factors that influence us. So here we have the micro level, and the labeling approach within this perspective suggests that if people are treated in particular ways, they may fulfill those expectations. Therefore, labeling of children has an impact on their school performance. If you watch the Jane Elliott experiment, when I asked you to watch the video, her experiment on separating the blue-eyed, brown-eyed group of children, when she did an activity, a school exercise, a class exercise, the children who were on the bottom, who were treated poorly in that experiment, they did poorly on that activity. They were told, they weren't, the other group was better, the other group was smarter, and so it affected them, and it affected their performance. The children who were on top scored better, and so there was definitely an impact. Also, children labeled as troublemakers in school, they may come to view themselves as troublemakers. There were two psychologists, Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. Lenore Jacobson was at one time a school principal. They wrote Pygmalion in the Classroom, and they documented what they refer to as teacher expectancy, a teacher expectancy effect. And this term refers to the impact of teacher expectations of a student's performance that impacts that student's actual performance. In other words, teachers who have high expectations of their students generally have students who perform better. It usually occurs in the lower grades up through third grade. So in an experiment, children in a San Francisco elementary school were given a verbal and reasoning pretest. The two psychologists then randomly selected 20% of the students, referring to them as the spurters. They had like an educational spurt. Children whom teachers could expect superior performance on a retest, the students scored significantly higher than before. Teachers evaluated the spurters as being more interesting, more curious, and better adjusted than their classmates. But again, remember, these students were randomly assigned. Other studies reveal that teachers will wait longer for answers from high achievers and more likely to give them a second chance. Also, there's research that shows students who sit in the front of a classroom make more eye contact with the teacher, and therefore the teacher may call on them more frequently than those who might sit in the back of the classroom. And here we have a table that summarizes the sociological perspectives we just covered: the functionalist, conflict, interactionist, and feminist perspective. And it shows you describing the emphasis. So take a minute to read those, and then we'll continue. Okay. Now we're going to talk about schools as formal organizations. Large-scale school systems are formal organizations in the same way as factories, hospitals, and even business firms. And like these types of organizations, schools are influenced by the market of potential students. So we're going to examine schools and their bureaucratic nature, teaching, we're going to look at teaching as an occupation, and then the student subculture. Now, Max Weber, if you remember, his 5 basic characteristics of a bureaucracy are evident in the majority of schools, whether they be elementary, secondary, or even college. And so we're going to take a look at the division of labor, the hierarchy of authority, written rules and regulations, impersonality, and employment based on technical qualifications. The increasing number of students in the school system combines with increased specialization and has resulted in this bureaucracy. So let's take first the division of labor. Specialized experts teach particular age levels and specific subjects. We have early childhood, elementary ed, middle school, high school, math, science, social studies, reading. Public and elementary secondary schools even hire teachers specialized to work with children with learning disabilities or physical impairments. That's a division of labor. Different teachers do different things. We also see the hierarchy of authority. Each employee of a school is responsible to a higher authority. Teachers report to a department head, who then reports to vice principals, the principal, who then reports ultimately to a superintendent, who then the superintendent of schools then must report to a board of education. So there's definitely that hierarchy, each employee being responsible to a higher authority. Also meets the written rules and regulations of a bureaucracy. Teachers and administrators must conform to numerous rules and regulations in the performance of their duties. They also must follow a curriculum, provide for standardized testing. There's individualized education plans for students, forms and meetings, and so they do conform to these rules and regulations. There's also the impersonality. Large class size makes it very difficult for teachers to give individual attention to students. Also, many students are often throughout the day sent off for specials, they call them, the art and music classes and library, and student teachers and aides often spend some time with children as well. And then there's employment based on technical qualifications. The hiring of teachers, college professors, all are based on professional competence and expertise. And typically certifications are required to show that level of education has been achieved. Now, generally speaking, functionalists take a positive view of the bureaucratization of education, in that students, teachers, and administrators will be dealt with fairly. Conflict theorists, on the other hand, they argue that there are some harmful consequences for disadvantaged persons. The view, for example, regarding standardized educational curricula, including textbooks, will generally reflect the dominant group and may ignore those of racial and ethnic minorities. With the relatively new offering of online and internet-based courses, there is a counter trend in the bureaucratization of schools, offering flexibility for both students and instructors. Now I'd like to talk about teachers as they undergo the many stresses. Conflicts arise among serving as an instructor, a disciplinarian, and an employee of a school district at the same time. Between a quarter and a third of new teachers quit within their first 3 years. for reasons such as teacher burnout or even violence in some schools. Fewer students are choosing teaching as a career due to a perceived low income. Now, in this data, in 2008, the average salary for all public elementary and secondary school teachers in the United States was reported at $51,009. And in 2011, 3.1% of both elementary and high school first-year college students were interested in elementary education and in high school education. These figures are down dramatically. So we're seeing definitely a change in the number of students who are going into education to begin with, and those who actually are going to stay there. So we've seen that, again, the number of first-year college students interested in teaching has significantly dropped. And here we have a much more current data point where it shows that in 2015 and 2016, the average salary for all public elementary and secondary school teachers was $58,353. And salaries they vary widely by state and also by school district. And I encourage anyone who's interested to go to a website called www.aft.org/salary to get a better idea, again, on what the most current average salaries are for teachers, and what the starting salary is, and what states do offer different salaries, and what even some experience, like the level of experience, is also calculated into some of these figures. The amount of education beyond your bachelor's degree to get to a higher level. So if you have a master's degree or additional certifications like a reading certificate or other special certificates to help students throughout the day, they also, even coaching, can help actually increase the salary that teachers achieve. So anyone going into the education field or teaching might want to take a look at that site, www.aft.org. This table is, again, a nice data set to look at in terms of what states offer what average salaries. These are the average salaries. So the national average salary was at $58,353. And if you look at the darker tan color, over $60,000, New Jersey falls into that category. Also, New York and Pennsylvania, California, Oregon. So you want to maybe look at states where they offer higher average salaries. Schools provide social and recreational needs for children. Interpersonal relationships develop in the school from early childhood into adulthood. Often college students meet their future spouse or partner and develop lifelong relationships. I often, when I'm in class, ask how many students have friends that they still maintain contact with since they were in elementary school, up through high school and even into college. And so you may not have, large numbers of friends, but, one or two friends that you've stayed close with over the years is always something that we tend to meet these individuals in our school experience. Students also, there's a subculture, and it's very complex when you look at the subculture of students. For example, high school cliques and social groups may develop based on various social factors like the individual's race or social class or physical attractiveness, placement in courses, even athletic ability and leadership roles. August Hollingshead conducted what has become known as a classic study of a community called Elmtown. And he found 259 distinct cliques in a single high school. The average size of the clique was about 5. It was usually centered on school, on recreational activities, and on religious and community groups. Similarly, researchers identified 4 ideal types of subcultures for college students. So we're going to go over those in a minute. I just want to point out, again, student cliques can be formed based on a variety of demographic and social factors: race, gender, sexual orientation, leadership roles. There's a program called T2K. I wanted to define Teachers 2000. So many teachers will join a group together. Those who are planning to become teachers, they know what courses to take. They kind of, know what to expect, what school districts, and pass along information to one another that have that common interest in mind. So students in groups centered on sexual orientation can be very vulnerable. Peer pressure is very intense. Particularly, they're particularly vulnerable in that peer group conformity is very intense at this particular age in general. And then students creating a lot of these gay-straight alliances to kind of overcome a lot of that pressure and any kind of discrimination or adversity. So here are the 4 distinct subcultures that I mentioned among college students. So this is something that researchers have identified. And you may or may not fall into, one, or there might be an overlap in a number of these subcultures. But collegiate, the first, focuses on having fun and socializing. Really little commitment to academics. So athletes kind of fall into this category or this subculture. Academic is the next subculture, and these are students that identify with the intellectual concerns of the faculty and value knowledge for its own sake. So the more academic, studious type subculture. The vocational subculture views college as a means of obtaining a degree essential for advancement in the future. The nonconformist seeks out ideas that may or may not relate to studies, to their academic studies. And so, these are definitely, they may be hostile to the college environment and then seek out other alternative ideas. They're the nonconformist. Students are expected to be competing subcultures. Students are exposed to these competing subcultures and, sort of align with the ones that seem most, related to their own feelings and interests. For many students, though, we're seeing that they may, avoid falling into these groups and go out on their own. But you may or may not find yourself. I would say I was probably in the academic. I was always a nerd. I was found in the library reading, and that was what interested me the most. But you can have, you can be collegiate, you can be fun-loving and focusing on, the fun of being in school, but also doing well in terms of academics. For many students in the United States, an alternative method of school is growing in popularity. And it's something we actually are falling into at this moment with the conditions of the pandemic we're under. About 1.7 million kids are homeschooled. So this is prior to any stay-at-home orders or any kind of virtual learning. This is something that was been in place where parents are choosing to homeschool their children. And parents may choose to homeschool their children because of academic concerns about peer pressure, or fears about violence in schools. So those are some of the reasons for the homeschooling that we have seen research about prior to this sort of required homeschooling that we're doing now. So it's quite different. Whether or not homeschooled children have adequate opportunities for socialization has always been a controversial issue when it comes to homeschooling. Some theorists cite lack of social involvement as a problem, but the proponents claim that children benefit from contact with others besides their own age group. So there might be, a group of siblings in the group. Some might be working at a higher, level of education, and so the younger children might benefit from that other older age group. Homeschools are good alternatives for children with ADHD and learning disabilities. There is an ease of the cultural transition for some immigrant children. So again, many of the reasons that parents would choose this as an option. So some of the criticism of homeschooling has to do with lack of socialization or isolation from the larger community. There's also the belief that students lose chances to improve their social skills. And I recall a study of, or a newspaper article that related an issue in a small town where homeschooled children were trying to participate in their local public school athletics and sports. And so the parents of the children who attended that public school were against it because they felt that the homeschooled children were going to come in and take spots away from their children who were trying out for the sport. So again, a lot of controversial issues arise in this homeschooling environment. Also, quality control issues. Quality control is an issue, and although it's legal in all 50 states, there is a lack of uniform standards. The Homeschool Defense Association in 2005 reported that homeschooled students scored higher than others on standardized tests in every subject and every grade. So they really, students in this case, are pretty much working at their own pace and can get more individualized education. So who is homeschooling their children? Parents who homeschool are more likely to have higher incomes and educational attainments themselves. Most are two-parent families, so that one parent can stay home and teach the children while the other can work for the family. And then on average, children of who are homeschooled watch less television. Research has shown that some students would probably do just as well in public school because of that strong parental involvement. The smaller versus the big class size are also better opportunities for student success.